Hello and welcome. I'm very glad you could be with me tonight. I have a fascinating and important guest tonight. Mel Duncan is with me. Many of you may have heard about his work. Many of you may know him from his work. He is the man who is the co-founder of the Nonviolent Peace Force. And I will have him define what the Peace Force does. He founded it back in 2002. He's been working with the UN the last 7 years very closely, and he's won many, many awards for his work, both international awards and state awards. So it's great to have him here with me. As a way to kind of set the stage, he and I have been talking about statistics and issues related to his work, and he tells me there are about 700 million children living in conflict zones in our world. 700 million. That number just kind of stuns a person, doesn't it? So we're going to talk about some of the exciting and hopeful, very hopeful things his organization is doing. So welcome back, Mel.
Oh, it's good to be here, Mary. Thank you.
He was on many years ago, and so, yeah, it's a treat to have you back. You founded the Nonviolent Peace Force with a man named David
Hartzell.
And I wondered what gave you really what I call the courage to found an organization where you send people into conflict areas all around the world. I mean, it's not an easy kind of a thing to envision and carry out.
Well, there were two things that I look back on that really shaped me doing this. One of them was in the early 80s during the war in Nicaragua. I was one of the people who went down and stayed on the border in villages when those villages were being attacked by a rebel group called the Contra to try to destabilize the government. And what we found is that if there were internationals in those villages, they were never attacked.
So internationals meaning people who were not aligned with either side.
Right. And coming from, primarily at that point, from North America, and as we later learned in the Iran-Contra hearings a couple of years later, this war was being orchestrated by the CIA out of the U.S. Embassy in Honduras. And so they didn't want white people from the United States being injured or killed. And so they would keep the Contras away if we were there. Now that was one of the influences. The deeper influence came when I was studying on a fellowship in the late 1990s, and I was in a course studying mystics, and I was confronted by a Sufi, Muslim mystic, who looked at me in the eyes and said, "And your job is to enter the heart of your enemy."
Really? And had he known you very long when he said this?
She and I had never met.
Oh my goodness, Mel.
And that set me on a path of starting to understand my work and indeed the world from a point of unity as opposed to a point of division. As an organizer, which you knew me all of my adult life, often I was involved in battles that was us versus them, right versus wrong, good versus evil, and I was challenged to my very cells to understand the world from a point of how we were connected. And I find now, especially in this era, how important that is, and to work from that understanding of what we have in common rather than what we have that divides us.
You're so right that this is a peak time for us versus them, isn't it? In our country, in the world. So you and David started recruiting civilians is that? Tell us a little bit about how that process worked.
Well, we first spent a couple of years maxing out our credit cards and visiting areas of violent conflict. He and I had both had experience in violent conflicts before that, but really listening to people about what they were doing that they found valuable and what, if anything, they might need from a group of well-trained, unarmed civilians. And we learned a lot. The most important things were no one makes anyone else's peace for them. That has to be done by local people. Secondly, we learned that there is creative and courageous peace-building and human rights work that's going on in the most violent places in the world, even today. More often than not, regardless of the culture, those efforts are being led by women. And what women told us time and time again is, if there's no consequence to our disappearance, we're much more likely to be killed. So even your presence with us will extend our ability to do our work. And the third most important thing that we learned was this wasn't a vision that had started with David Hartsoe or started with me, but was a recurrent vision and had occurred and recurred to enough of us that we're now ready to put our time and our talent and our lives on the line to building a nonviolent peace force.
One thinks of Gandhi, of course, when we think of your work.
And Gandhi, when he was assassinated, was working on the Shanti Sena, which is Sanskrit for the peace army.
Right. Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes. And when we started, you mentioned 2002, our convening event was in India, and 150 people from throughout the world came. And at the very end, we went to the site where Gandhi had been killed. And there's little cement footsteps in the lawn going up to a modest monument where he was shot. So each of us walked in a meditative way along those footsteps and paid our respects, and then fanned out on the lawn surrounding the area. And people spontaneously broke out in song and prayers in their own language. So it was a brilliant cacophony.
Wow.
And then one of the delegates, Ela Gandhi, his granddaughter, stepped forward and started reading from the Mahatma's works.
Wow.
And then ended and sent us on our way by saying, my grandfather would be very happy today.
Wow. So, my not knowing this story, I am so glad I asked. You right now are sending civilians into 4 primary areas: South Sudan, Bangladesh, Iraq?
Yes, the Kurdish area of Iraq.
And what's the 4th one now?
Well, there's 2 more.
Oh, 2
Myanmar
more.
and the Mindanao region of the Philippines.
That's right. And how many people are involved if we look at the total? How big?
We have a little over 200. Our largest deployment is in South Sudan. Our newest deployment is in the northern area of Iraq in the Kurdish areas. And one of the things that's very interesting that our team is doing there is providing protection for the widows and the children of the ISIS fighters.
Really?
Because they are indeed despised.
Yes, they would be.
And they come from many parts of the world, many without much consent of them being there in the first place. But here they are now as widows and with children, not knowing where to go. And so our teams actually, we have a team that lives in the camp where they are living and provides protective presence and patrolling on a daily basis.
So, protective patrolling, meaning just being there, witnessing what's going on, and their very presence is a deterrent for anything
Our presence
harmful?
often is a deterrent, but we also know ways to intervene in violence and to de-escalate it. And we only work on a nonpartisan basis, and so it's our business to communicate with all the combatants, whether it be the government or the non-state actors, and to be able to communicate with them. We don't accept what they're doing. They don't necessarily love us, but they have to know why we're there. We're there to protect civilians and deter violence, and how we can communicate with each other.
And do they respect that?
Usually. Not always. And what we do doesn't work in every situation. So we carefully assess about the various armed actors. What are their vulnerabilities? What are their interests? It's our business to know that and address those interests. And so in February, I was in a very remote area of South Sudan. And this man said to me, you know, the militia is on best behavior when your people are around. And I said, well, why would they care about that? And he said, because they know there's a reckoning in the future. There's something down there, whether it's a tribunal or the International Criminal Court, and they don't want your people showing up to testify
To be
what they've
witnessing.
done.
Interesting.
But there's also personal dynamics to what we do. Because we're nonviolent, we tend to encourage that in other people. And it's also sometimes like domestic abuse seldom takes place in the shopping mall. It takes place behind closed doors.
Right.
And so when there's others there to observe it, it is a deterrent.
I think as a mother, a grandmother, friend, I love what you're doing, but if one of my kids wanted to join the group, I think I would be so fearful for them. How do you deal with fear for those who are considering joining the Nonviolent Peace Force? How do you handle your own fear? And am I being too dramatic here? But it feels like that is a real human issue to contend with.
You're more on the wise side than the dramatic side. We do live and work in dangerous places. That doesn't mean that we're out to make ourselves martyrs. We have a very strict and strategic security protocol. People have to adhere to that or they go home. There are times when we will withdraw our people if we are no longer able to protect ourselves. And the fear issue is interesting. I don't trust people who tell me, oh, I'm not afraid. I'd rather know and have people admit to their fears, because I am. I'm afraid often, not all the time. Not to have it control us, but to be aware, and fear is there for a reason. And if it makes us more aware and sharper, then it's important to acknowledge that.
So the training, as I hear you describing this, Mel, is critical to the success of what you're doing.
Yes.
Is it months of training? How do you, just in a nutshell, describe it?
It really is ongoing training. And it starts with a mission preparedness training, which is really an extended screening for people. Not everybody makes it through that training, and we would rather have them wash out then than in the field.
Right.
So we spend a lot of time first on understanding nonviolence and the basics of nonviolence, to understanding how one lives and works nonpartisan, in a nonpartisan way. And a basis for that is empathy. And while we are born, we're empathetic beings. Often that gets conditioned out of us. But fortunately, we can reawaken that. And so part of our training is on empathy, it's on listening, it's on dialogue, It's on the primacy of local actors, because they are really the ones who will bring the peace. We are there to support them, not to bring in other ideas, but to listen carefully and not so much do capacity development, as often is talked about, but really to do capacity recognition.
And that, explain that in some more words. Capacity recognition.
What we found is that every community has within it its own structures, its own responses, its own way to deter violence, to protect themselves. Now, sometimes because of the severity of the violence, those approaches have been overwhelmed. But our job isn't to, so to speak, to cure them or to bring in our ways. Our job is to help bring the violence back to a level where they can use their mechanisms
Okay. That makes sense. When you think of the countries you're in now, the countries you've been in, what practices or what programs do you think are kind of universally taking hold that you can replicate and take into new areas?
Yes. Well, we've discovered 10 methods of active nonviolence that will work to protect civilians and to deter violence. One of the most often used is accompaniment, where we will have people accompany other people who are under threat. They could be under threat because they're journalists or because they are human rights defenders. They could be under threat because of their ethnicity or because of their gender. So, for example, in South Sudan, where there's been a brutal war that reignited at the end of 2013, hundreds of thousands of people have congregated into areas that are called protectionist civilian areas. The women have to leave every day to collect firewood, to come back and cook. Routinely, when they leave, they're raped, either by the government soldiers or by the rebels. Rape is a weapon of war that is used strategically and brutally. What we have found is that if we send 3 to 5 of our people with 20 to 30 women, there's never been a rape.
Wow.
The soldiers will look
again,
the other
just
way.
the presence.
Well, and we work a lot in advance. We know the combatants. They know who we are. They know why we're there. We communicate in advance. We're going here because we never want to surprise someone. If we've surprised someone in the field, we haven't done our job.
And how do you let them know, Mel? I mean,
Oh, cell phones are ubiquitous.
oh, they are.
Yeah.
Okay, even in South Sudan.
Yeah.
And you said the women are gathering firewood. I'm also thinking gathering or bringing water back, aren't they also?
In these camps, water is usually
it is. Oh,
supplied.
okay.
So water isn't nearly the issue as the scarcity of firewood. And as they're there, the surrounding area is becoming defoliated, which means they have to go further and further,
Right, for the
sometimes
wood.
20 kilometers into the bush.
Oh my goodness. So think
And then
of
they
that.
come back and they cook
Right, and then clean up and then
and take care of the kids.
gather again. We only have about 8 minutes left. I want to also have you explain some of the exciting things that are going on with your organization and the UN. And he has lived in New York, worked there intensely the last 7 years. And some really neat things have just happened this year. Give us the lowdown.
Well, the most recent thing is in July, the General Assembly passed a resolution that recognized and recommended unarmed approaches, and that the UN peacekeeping department should work with local communities on nonviolent solutions. And that is big.
And that's a first,
yes,
isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, you must feel tremendously proud of that big movement.
Well, yes, and now we have to make sure that it's implemented.
That it's carried out, yes.
And the
It's a
reason, Mary,
challenge.
is you had mentioned about the 700,000 children who live in areas of violent conflict. In a study that was released by the World Bank and the UN last March, they showed that the number of violent conflicts and the number of civilians who are killed in violent conflicts is increasing and has been increasing since 2010. The UN High Commission on Refugees in June said that there are more people who have had to flee violent conflict than any time since they've started keeping records. And that number is growing. And so we have to learn nonviolent, effective, affordable ways to provide protection, to deter violence, so that communities and people can pick up these methods from throughout the world. We will have conflict. And we will have conflict that is exacerbated by climate change. It already is. And that will increase. And so it's so important that our children and our grandchildren have these tools and these methods to work out conflict nonviolently.
It would be called a crisis without any hyperbole, wouldn't it, right now, that we are in globally?
It is a crisis. Yes, the number of civilians. In fact, the High Commissioner on Refugees said that someone is fleeing their home in this world every 2 seconds.
And the number of people then who are moving, who are transit, has got to be, what? I think I read once, 1 out of 6, something like that.
Right now, there's over 67 million who have been displaced. And you see then the political effect that has. You see the migration, or it's not migration, the refugees who are fleeing to Europe. And you see the response when Angela Merkel welcomed them in, and then the political response and the reaction that we've seen in from the White House in this country.
Right.
When we have people who are fleeing areas of Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras because of war, because of violent conflict. It may not be called war, but that's what's happening. And they're coming to this border and they're being warehoused in closed down Walmarts. And we all know about the separation that's happening with the children and the trauma that visits upon the families and those children is not short-lived.
No, it's ongoing. These kids are traumatized, I'm sure, for years.
Yes.
How do you keep hope with, especially our current administration, but also the reactionary kind of things going on around the world? What keeps you going? What gives you hope? And who can you kind of hitch up with to move this critical new paradigm, really, of thinking about our world?
Where I find hope is at the grassroots, in local areas, working with people whom will never know their names and who are the true history makers right now. So, for example, recently I was with a group of women in South Sudan who have formed women's protection teams. There's 40 of those teams right now in South Sudan that we support. Those women will intervene to keep their children from being abducted and forced to become child soldiers. Recently, they came together across ethnic lines and walked through the bush to the camp of the general of one of the armed groups. By the time they got there were 150 of them from 2 ethnic groups that have been pitted against each other, they were together. They weren't going to be driven apart. And they demanded to see the general. They were told no, and they said, we'll wait.
Wow.
And they got in, and they said, we're tired. We're tired of our children being abducted. We're tired of being raped. We're tired of this war, and we want you to stop. Well, the general said, well, I've never met with a group like you, and I'm sure he hadn't.
Right.
And they believe that they did have an impact on reducing the violence in that area. And whether they did or not, the fact that women came together, realized their own agency, crossed boundaries, and did a courageous
Took
act.
control in a
Yes.
sense. Yes.
Is the change in it of itself. That's
So-
what gives me hope.
Well, that's a great story. I wish we could have more time, but what a wonderful story to end on and really help us understand how this can keep going and grow. If you want more information, and I'm sure you are intrigued, www.nonviolentpeaceforce.org. And it's a great website, a lot of personal stories on it. Thank you so much, Mel, for coming down again and updating me and updating the viewers. And I'm so impressed, really, with what you're doing, what you've tackled, what lies ahead.
Yes.
So thank you from me and from all the people listening, I'm sure. It's
Thank
great
you,
to
Mary.
see you again.
It's good to be with you.
Yes. Do check out his website, again, www.nonviolentpeaceforce.org. Thank you for being with us. I'll be back again next week. Till then, have a good week.